So this video is going to talk about how the United States becomes increasingly involved in Vietnam in the period 1956 to 1963. I'm going to follow the New South Wales syllabus for conflict in Indochina for modern history. This picture in many ways tells us a lot about what the United States strategy in South Vietnam is. On the left you got President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he's shaking hands with South Vietnamese President Ngo Diem. Standing between them is John Foster Dulles, the United States Secretary of State. Dulles and Eisenhower are concerned with the containment of communism. Containment is a concept that had been around since the 1940s. And essentially it says that the United States needs to keep communism where it is, that they don't want communism to expand to other countries where it currently doesn't exist. The reason for this is they believe that communism contains the seeds of its own destruction. Given sufficient time, communism will self-destruct. It'll implode upon itself. But it's got to be given the opportunity to do that, and if it's allowed to expand, it could quite possibly gain new strength and sustain itself for much longer. Eisenhower added his own domino theory to this, where basically he said each region of the world is like a row of dominoes, and if the first domino in the region goes, then the subsequent dominoes certainly follow. But if you can get that first domino to stand up and you can prop it up and keep it from falling, then effectively you can protect the rest of the region. And this is what Eisenhower and Dulles sought to do with South Vietnam. The United States support for Diem was actually quite lukewarm. Eisenhower sent an advisor over to view Diem's government. This was General Lightning Joe Collins from World War II. Collins was not impressed, and it was going to advise Eisenhower to pull the plug on Diem, but literally, as Collins is considering submitting his report, Diem takes steadfast action against his rivals and manages to eliminate them. Because he was able to eliminate the remaining rivals in South Vietnam, the United States decided that he was good enough to hold that role. So what does this actually mean? Well, the United States did not want to go sending its troops all over the world. Containment under Truman had involved sending United States troops to various hotspots, for example Korea, when the North Koreans invaded the South. Instead, what the United States wants to do is it wants to provide money and training. So South Vietnam and the Republic of Vietnam are going to receive significant aid from the United States under Eisenhower. Over $1 billion flows to South Vietnam. This is the fifth largest recipient of aid of any country in the world. In addition to giving money, the United States created the Military Assistance Advisor Group, and this was to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The whole idea here was to give them the training they needed to become a viable army and therefore able to resist any threat from the Communist North. Diem is not a particularly popular politician, and he fails to initiate any kind of significant reforms. For example, one of the things he did is he did away with local elections. Not that Vietnam had ever been a particularly democratic nation, but there had been a long tradition of allowing villages to elect local officials. Diem was concerned that a lot of the members of the NLF communists were winning these elections, and therefore he wanted to put his own officials in charge. This was deeply unpopular, and the United States was concerned about this. So the big question is how we go from this picture here of Diem and Eisenhower shaking hands to this over here, which is Marines waiting ashore at Da Nang in March of 1965. How does this process happen? Well, what we need to look at is what happens during the Kennedy administration. Kennedy was elected President of the United States in November 1960, taking office in January of 1961. He campaigned on a promise to turn the tide of the Cold War. The problem was that though he talked tough, he didn't carry this out in his actions. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster, and when Kennedy went to Vienna to meet with Khrushchev, he was supposed to go over there and tell Khrushchev a thing or two, and instead Khrushchev wound up telling Kennedy a thing or two. Therefore, Kennedy is under pressure to do something somewhere in the world to show that he's taking action against communism. The National Liberation Front, the communists in South Vietnam, were putting increasing pressure on the government of South Vietnam, and whereas previously, when he'd taken office, Kennedy could kind of put Vietnam on the back burner, the pressure the NLF put on Diem's government meant that he couldn't really keep it on the back burner anymore. For example, the infiltration rates had doubled between 1958 and the beginning of 1961. There were many more men and women coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the NLF also managed to take control of the provincial capital not that far from Saigon. It was only about 50 miles away. And so the threat of the communists in South Vietnam is looking much worse, and Kennedy's under pressure to do something about it. On the one hand, he doesn't want to send regular US forces, but on the other hand, he's unwilling to pull out of Vietnam and make it look like yet another failure after he campaigned on a promise to get tough with the communists. So what does he do? He sends advisors and more money, and what he does is he sets up the Strategic Hamlet program. So the number of advisors in South Vietnam increases from a little over 3,000 to 9,000, and very quickly after that to about 12,000. The United States also reluctantly supported the creation of these strategic hamlets. The idea was to create fortified villages so that the NLF could not get into the villages and indoctrinate the villagers on the wonders of communism and how they should revolt against the South Vietnamese government. How does this work? Well, initially there's some success, particularly the introduction of more US military equipment in early 1962 does seem to make a difference. In particular, the introduction of helicopters gave the South Vietnamese troops an advantage. Nonetheless, by the end of 1962, the NLF had learned how to deal with the helicopters and the increased American presence, and so a lot of the initial gains at the start of the year were reversed. It was estimated by the CIA that by the end of 1962, the NLF had 300,000 supporters in the South, active supporters that is, and nearly 1 million passive supporters. At this point, one could argue that the United States still saw Vietnam as an operational rather than a policy problem. Now, what does this mean? Well, policy is the overall strategy you're going to use to win. In other words, we're going to send men, we're going to send supplies. And these men, all they're going to do is they're going to be advisors. So we have advisors, and we have money. The operational side is exactly how you implement a policy. So in other words, it's about the details of what you do. So the details here would be the amount of advisors, the amount of money, the amount of arms that are sent, how they're used, the type of training, that sort of thing. So if Vietnam is an operational rather than a policy problem, that's essentially saying that the United States seems to believe that the implementation of its policy is somewhat flawed, and it just needs to tweak the policy so that the implementation is more effective. It doesn't need to just toss away the entire policy altogether. So if it's an operational problem, you fix the details of what you're doing on the ground rather than challenging the fundamental assumptions of the overall policy. Nonetheless, we have problems. This is a rather confronting picture. This is a picture which appeared all over the front pages of US newspapers and on the nightly news media. This was a result of Diem's campaign against the Buddhists. And in this picture you see a monk, Buddhist monk, who's doused himself in petrol, gasoline, and then set himself on fire. He's done this as a protest against Diem's policies. Diem was Catholic, and he decided to, for reasons that sort of have an historical background, given the way that the Buddhists had persecuted Catholics in the 19th century, Diem was reluctant to give the Buddhists the same rights as he gave to the Catholics. So, for example, one of the incidents that precipitated these protests were Diem's, he'd given permission to Catholics to celebrate and have a parade on Easter, but he refused to allow Buddhists to fly a flag to celebrate the Buddha's birthday. Diem engineered raids against pagodas. And so this pressure that the Buddhists were able to put on Diem, and they did this very specifically because they knew that the US media would take these pictures. They had signs that were in English. Few, if any of them, spoke English, but yet these signs were in English, clearly intended for the US media and the US home front and the benefit of US politicians. As a result of this, there appears to have been a perceived need for a change in policy. In particular, there appears to have been the United States, where they previously said that if Diem was no longer president, the aid would dry up. The United States expressed a certain level of willingness to support whatever government it was in South Vietnam. As a result of this, at the very least, because of U.S. tacit permission, and possibly, although the evidence on this is very unclear, at the very least the United States appears to have given tacit permission for a coup that removes Diem from power. The process continues. Rather than creating more stability, the assassination of Diem created more instability. Lyndon Johnson took over the presidency a mere 3 weeks later, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy back in the United States. December of 1963, the communists decide that this is a perfect opportunity to increase pressure on South Vietnam. How do they do this? Well, they increase the infiltration rates yet again, and they up the pressure on U.S. Surveillance ships that are patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin. This leads to the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964. In this incident, an American torpedo boat, an American ship that was conducting surveillance, the USS Mannix, was fired on by a North Vietnamese torpedo boat. They were warned and told not to do it again. The next night, a second attack allegedly took place. The best evidence at this point suggests that a second attack didn't take place, but at the time there appears at least to have been the perception that it had. As a result of this, Johnson went to Congress and asked for the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution was effectively a blank check, which gave the President the permission to wage war in Vietnam as required. So, what does he do? Well, Johnson was actually quite restrained. He ordered an initial bombing attack against the torpedo boat bases in North Vietnam, but beyond that he didn't do much. However, the Communists did keep the pressure on. They attacked the Bien Hoa Air Base outside of Saigon. They set off a bomb at the Brinks Hotel in Saigon. The Brinks Hotel was a location where many Americans stayed. And then finally, in February of 1965, they launched an attack against an American air base at Pleiku in the Central Highlands. This prompted Johnson then to initiate what was known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Now, the thing about Rolling Thunder was that a bombing campaign, one could argue, as George Herring does, had built into it its own logic for escalation. If you're going to bomb, you need bombers. And if you have bombers, you need air bases. If you have air bases, you need someone to protect those air bases. And these Marines can't just stand at the perimeter of the air base with their guns pointed outward saying, yep, come on, bring it. Instead, they actually have to go and they have to patrol around the air bases. And so the American troops started patrolling aggressively within a 50-mile radius of these air bases. As a result of this, we have this process of escalation, which goes from the decision to bomb and slowly escalates towards the introduction of American troops in March of 1965 into South Vietnam. So is this a slippery slope? It's something that I leave you to decide, but I think the notion of a slippery slope provides one way to think through what is happening in South Vietnam with U.S. engagement.